Victoria hesitated at the doorstep of the Bellamy residence, an uneasy feeling settling in the pit of her stomach as she gazed at the suburban house. There was something about the place that felt off, something lurking beneath the surface. Pushing aside her apprehension, she knocked, and Mrs. Bellamy greeted her with a warm smile, welcoming her inside. As Victoria settled into her role as the babysitter for the Bellamy family, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Ethan, the eldest Bellamy sibling, had an intense gaze that seemed to follow her everywhere, sending shivers down her spine. She tried to brush it off as teenage awkwardness, but as the days passed, his presence became increasingly unsettling. Mrs. Bellamy and her husband informed Victoria that they were going away for the weekend, leaving her in charge of Ethan and his younger siblings. Despite her growing unease, Victoria agreed. She needed the extra money, and it seemed like an easy enough job. Throughout the weekend, Victoria's discomfort only grew. Ethan's eyes seemed to undress her with his every gaze, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. One night as she lay in bed, pretending to sleep, she heard the faint sound of footsteps outside her door. Keeping one eye open, she watched in horror as Ethan slipped into her room. He rifled through her belongings, sniffing and smelling every piece of lingerie Victoria brought there, his hand lingering on her underwear before he finally slipped out of the room. Shaken by the encounter, Victoria tried to carry on as normal. On Saturday afternoon, she decided to tidy up the house while the children were occupied with their toys. In Ethan's room, she stumbled upon a box hidden in the back of his closet. Opening it, she found an array of disturbing items: lipstick tubes, a camera, condoms, photos of women, lacy lingerie, and makeup palettes, all arranged meticulously as if they were trophies. As the weekend wore on, Victoria's unease only deepened. Late on Sunday evening, while searching for a missing toy in the basement, she stumbled upon a chilling discovery: a small fridge tucked away in a corner. With trembling hands, she opened it, revealing a grotesque imagery of sawed-off woman body parts in plastic bags. The sight made Victoria's blood run cold, and she stumbled back in horror, bile rising in her throat. She could feel the weight of Ethan's perverted gaze on her, his presence suffocating her as she struggled to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around her. Victoria, in shock, called the authorities, but wasn't able to utter a single word to them. It wasn't until the police arrived, investigating the sudden disappearance of another babysitter, that Victoria learned the horrifying truth. Ethan had been preying on unsuspecting babysitters, his obsession spiraling out of control as he collected mementos of his victims. In the midst of the chaos, Ethan was led away in handcuffs, his eyes burning with manic intensity. As he was being escorted into the police car, he turned to Victoria, his voice ringing out in a chilling, psychotically twisted declaration. "I love you, Victoria. I'm going to make you mine." Victoria recoiled in horror, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched Ethan being taken away. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over her, knowing that she had narrowly escaped becoming another victim of his twisted obsession the night Ethan lurked in her bedroom. Mrs. Thompson was in a bind, desperately needing a last-minute babysitter for her children, Emily and Jack. Thankfully, Mrs. Wilson, their elderly neighbor, offered to help out. Despite Mrs. Wilson's occasional memory lapses due to her advancing dementia, Mrs. Thompson trusted her enough to agree. As Mrs. Thompson rushed out the door for her appointment, Mrs. Wilson arrived, her usual warmth tinged with a hint of forgetfulness. Emily and Jack greeted her with smiles, eager for a night of fun with their neighbor. The evening started off smoothly enough. Mrs. Wilson played games with the kids, her moments of confusion mostly overshadowed by her genuine affection for them. However, as the night wore on, her behavior took a sudden and alarming turn. In a sudden bout of confusion, Mrs. Wilson suggested they bake cookies. Emily and Jack hesitated but eventually agreed, hoping it would distract Mrs. Wilson from her confusion. However, things quickly spiraled out of control. As they gathered ingredients in the kitchen, Mrs. Wilson's confusion deepened. In a frightening moment, she began to tie Emily and Jack to their chairs, mistaking them for cookie dough. Panic surged through the children as they realized the danger they were in. With trembling hands, Mrs. Wilson opened the oven door, intending to place the children inside. Emily and Jack screamed for help, their voices drowned out by Mrs. Wilson's confused mutterings. To add to the horror, Mrs. Wilson grabbed a container of oil and began pouring it over the children, thinking she was greasing the baking tray. The slick liquid coated Emily and Jack, making their struggles even more frantic. As if that wasn't enough, Mrs. Wilson then grabbed a nearby container of salt and started sprinkling it over the children, mistaking it for sugar. The sharp grains stung their skin, adding to their terror. Just as Mrs. Wilson was about to carry out her terrifying plan, there was a frantic knock at the door. Mrs. Thompson, returning home unexpectedly, burst into the kitchen, her heart pounding with fear at the sight before her. With a mother's instinct, she rushed to free Emily and Jack from their restraints, while Mrs. Wilson, overcome with confusion, could only watch in bewilderment. In the aftermath of the harrowing ordeal, Mrs. Thompson comforted her children, grateful that they were safe. It was clear that Mrs. Wilson's dementia had caused her to become dangerously confused, putting the children at risk. Though shaken by the experience, Emily and Jack were relieved to be out of harm's way. And while Mrs. Thompson vowed never to leave her children alone with Mrs. Wilson again, she couldn't help but feel a sliver of sympathy for their elderly neighbor, whose mind had betrayed her in the most terrifying way possible. Amelia had been babysitting for the Johnsons for months now. The job was straightforward enough. Keep an eye on little Timmy, put him to bed at his usual hour, and wait for Mr. and Mrs. Johnson to return home. But tonight was different. Tonight, Amelia had her boyfriend Josh over. The Johnsons had made it explicitly clear that they didn't want anyone else in the house while they were away. But Amelia had convinced herself it would be harmless. After all, what harm could a quick visit from Josh do? As the night wore on, Timmy grew increasingly annoyed with Amelia. He didn't like her attitude and the way she talked down to him. He decided he had had enough and wanted to call his parents to tell them how the babysitter was treating him. When Timmy attempted to dial his parents' number, Amelia caught him in the act. Frustrated with his disobedience, she snatched the phone away and locked him in his room, scolding him for misbehaving. Downstairs, Amelia and Josh were enjoying their evening, oblivious to Timmy's distress. The house felt eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustle of the wind outside. Then, the silence shattered. A loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Amelia froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Josh's eyes widened with fear as they both realized what was happening. Someone was breaking in. Panic surged through Amelia as she remembered locking Timmy in his room. She dashed upstairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. But when she reached Timmy's door, it was too late. He wasn't there. Meanwhile, downstairs, the burglars ransacked the house, their greed driving them forward. They had seen the Johnsons leave earlier that evening, assuming the house was empty and ripe for the taking. Unbeknownst to them, Timmy had managed to slip out of his room, determined to escape the clutches of his negligent babysitter. As Timmy crept downstairs, he stumbled upon the burglars in the midst of their crime. Fear gripped him as he realized the danger he was in. He tried to run, but one of the burglars caught him, grabbing him roughly by the arm. Just as Timmy was about to scream for help, Josh, who had followed Amelia upstairs, charged into the room, catching the burglars off guard. A fierce struggle ensued, but Josh managed to overpower them, driving them out of the house. As the police arrived to secure the scene, Timmy's parents returned home to find their house in disarray, but they were grateful to find Timmy safe and sound. As they sat together in the aftermath, Timmy's parents listened intently as he recounted his harrowing ordeal. And as they looked at Amelia, they couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if Josh hadn't been there to save their son.